January 23, 1989, Florida State Prison. Ted Bundy had less than 24 hours to live. He had confessed to 30 murders, though investigators believed the real number was higher. He had exhausted every appeal. The execution was set for 7 a.m. the following morning, and yet he agreed to one final interview, not with a detective, not with a prosecutor, with a psychologist. What Bundy said in that room, and more importantly, how he said it, would become one of the most studied pieces of psychological evidence in the history of criminal profiling. Because Ted Bundy wasn't just a killer, he was a case study in how a human mind can function without the one thing that makes us human. Theodore Robert Bundy was born in Burlington, Vermont in 1946, the illegitimate son of a young woman who, to avoid the stigma of the era, initially told him she was his sister. He grew up believing his grandparents were his parents. When he eventually learned the truth, he never spoke about it publicly, but people who knew him described a shift, a withdrawal, a coldness that dated from around that time. By his 20s, Bundy was, by all external appearances, exactly the kind of person society rewards. He was studying law at the University of Utah. He had worked on a gubernatorial campaign in Washington state. He was described by colleagues as brilliant, charming, and unusually persuasive. His supervisor at the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, a criminologist, later said he was one of the best people she had ever worked with. She wrote him a letter of recommendation. At the same time he was writing that letter, Ted Bundy was killing women. The confirmed timeline of Bundy's murders begins in 1974, though he later suggested the actual start was years earlier. His method was consistent. He approached his victims in public spaces, college campuses, beaches, ski resorts. He was handsome. He spoke well. He sometimes wore a fake cast on his arm or used crutches, asking women to help him carry something to his car. The car was a Volkswagen Beetle. The front passenger seat had been removed. His victims were almost universally young women with long hair parted in the middle, a description that matched his college girlfriend from whom he had been rejected. This detail matters. We'll come back to it. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy operated across 7 states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Florida, and California. He escaped from custody twice. The first escape from a courthouse library in Aspen, Colorado in June 1977. He jumped from a second-story window and fled into the mountains. He was recaptured 8 days later. The second escape, 6 months later, was more calculated. He had been deliberately losing weight, creating enough room to squeeze through a small gap in the ceiling of his cell. On December 30th, 1977, at 1 a.m., he climbed through that gap, walked through a guard's apartment. While he slept and walked out the front door, he wasn't recaptured for 46 days. In that time, he killed again. What made catching Bundy so difficult, and what makes him so significant in the history of criminal investigation, is the very thing that makes him psychologically fascinating. He looked nothing like what people expected a killer to look like. In 1974, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was barely 3 years old. Criminal profiling as a scientific discipline didn't yet exist. Investigators were working from intuition and experience, neither of which had prepared them for someone like Bundy. The Seattle detectives who first linked Bundy's name to the disappearances did so not through forensic evidence, but through tips. Multiple people independently called in the same name, including his girlfriend. She had noticed disturbing things: the plaster of Paris he kept in his room, the items she couldn't explain, the behavior that didn't add up. She reported her concerns to police. They investigated and moved on. No one wanted to believe it. That psychological resistance, the impossibility of reconciling the charming, intelligent man they knew with the crimes being described, would delay Bundy's capture by years. It was a traffic stop, ultimately. February 1978 in Pensacola, Florida. A patrol officer ran Bundy's license plate and found the car was stolen. Standard procedure. When Bundy was booked, his fingerprints matched prints from the scene of his last attacks, a sorority house at Florida State University, where he had attacked 4 women in a single night. He was convicted in 1979, sentenced to death, spent a decade on death row. This is where the story becomes something else entirely. Because the question investigators and psychologists kept returning to was not just what Bundy did, it was how. How does a person who understood human psychology well enough to study it, who had worked in victim services, who had counseled women escaping domestic violence, use that knowledge to hunt? Dr. Al Carlisle, a psychologist at the Utah State Prison, spent over 100 hours with Bundy during his incarceration. What he observed fundamentally changed his understanding of psychopathy. He had learned, Carlisle later wrote, to perform empathy, not to feel it, to recognize the behavioral markers of emotional connection and reproduce them with sufficient accuracy that almost no one noticed the difference. This is the clinical core of psychopathy, not the absence of emotional intelligence, but the absence of emotional experience. Bundy knew what compassion looked like. He had observed it carefully, the way an actor studies a role. What he had never felt, not once according to every psychologist who assessed him, was compassion itself. His victims weren't people to him, they were, and he used this word himself in interviews, possessions, objects he was entitled to acquire. The narcissistic architecture beneath the psychopathy. January 23, 1989. The psychologist who sat across from Bundy in his final interview was James Dobson, not a forensic psychologist by training, which may be precisely why Bundy agreed to the meeting. For 50 minutes, Bundy talked. He spoke about pornography, arguing that violent sexual content had driven his behavior. He positioned himself as a victim of media influence. He expressed concern for other young men who might be corrupted by the same material. Forensic psychologists who later analyzed the interview were not impressed. Dr. Robert Hare, the developer of the PCLR, described Bundy's final interview as "a masterclass in controlled impression management." Every element of the performance had a strategic function. The pornography narrative externalized blame, a hallmark PCLR marker. The concern for other young men performed empathy, the same skill Carlisle had documented years earlier. The calm, measured delivery projected rationality, Bundy's lifelong tool for disarming skepticism. And beneath all of it, audible to anyone who knew what to listen for, was something else. Pride, not remorse, not fear, though he claimed to feel both. The faint, unmistakable satisfaction of someone who believes they are, even in their final hours, the most interesting person in the room. The narcissism, intact to the end. Here is what Ted Bundy reveals, not about a monster, but about a pattern, the dissociation between public performance and private reality, the ability to operate in victim services while being the threat, precision calibrated for maximum effect. This is not a profile that belongs only to serial killers. The same architecture, grandiosity without guilt, charm without conscience, intelligence deployed against rather than for the people around him, appears in a spectrum of contexts. Most people with this profile never kill anyone. They don't need to. They destroy careers. They gaslight partners for decades. They defraud investors. They run countries. The violence is the rare end of a very long spectrum, and focusing only on the violence means we miss everything else. Ted Bundy was executed on January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m. 200 people gathered outside the prison as the execution took place. Some held signs, some cheered. The detective who had spent years hunting him, Bob Keppel, later said the hardest part wasn't catching Bundy, it was explaining him. People wanted him to be a monster, Keppel said, because monsters are different from us. What Bundy showed us, what he proved, is that the thing we were afraid of wore the same face as everyone else. Understanding Ted Bundy doesn't mean excusing him. It means understanding the psychology that allowed him to exist, unseen, unchallenged, for years. Because that psychology isn't unique to him. And the earlier you learn to recognize it, the less damage it can do. That's what we're here to understand. Subscribe to Mindcrime, new video every week. And if this one gave you something to think about, we're just getting started.